Okay, so how does COVID-19 vaccine work? Well, this is the first mRNA vaccine ever. And that's all the vaccines that you've heard, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson and Johnson. And basically what you see from this picture is that in a cell, right, mRNA is delivered, and it's just a blueprint for the spike protein that we saw on the first slide. So however it's delivered, it goes into apparatus called the ribosome and gets converted into the spike protein itself. And the nature of cells is that once that protein is made, it will then go to the cell surface and display. And that display is important because once the spike protein is displayed on any cell, our immune system learns about the existence. And because it's displayed on something called the MHC, or major histocompatibility complex, we know that that is foreign. Now, there are two different mechanisms to get the mRNA into the cell. On the left side, you see the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, and basically, someone has put the mRNA um, genetic code into an oil droplet, and it's injected into the bloodstream, and it diffuses into the cell surface. The other vaccine, and those would be AstraZeneca and Johnson and Johnson, they are the mRNA is packaged into a virus, which is really interesting. You basically given a virus which attacks our cells, but it's been attenuated so it doesn't cause disease. But that is the mechanism of delivery. And once that um, virus enters the cell, it delivers not mRNA, but DNA. DNA, which is incorporated into the nucleus of the cell, which then pumps out mRNA and then goes back to the slide previous. The end result, as I hinted, was that the proteins that have been produced by the mRNA strands, either directly or indirectly, get displayed on the cell, and then our white cells get to work. And we have different types of white cells that basically learn about this protein, and it decides, well, this is foreign and needs to be destroyed. And so eventually, a cell called a B cell just produce a lot of antibodies. And these antibodies attack any floating viruses and prevent them from entering the cell, because the virus uses the spike protein to enter the cell. And so if they're all covered with the antibodies, that's not going to work. And they also clump them up like a clot and say, hey, macrophages, hey, neutrophils, hey, other white cells, eat me up. So that was a little bit technical. So I did find this video, and I thought it was useful in summarizing what I just shared.
The basic idea is that you would get a shot that contains faint versions of the virus. The vaccine would expose your body to a version of the virus that is too weak to cause infection, but just strong enough to stimulate an immune response. Within a few weeks, cells in your immune system would make markers called antibodies, which would be specific for only the coronavirus, or specifically its spike protein. Antibodies then attach to the virus and prevent it from attaching to your cells. Your immune system then responds to signals from the antibodies by consuming and destroying the clumps of viruses. If you then catch the real virus at a later stage, your body would recognize it and destroy it. In other words, your immune system is now primed. The basic idea.
Okay. So hopefully, or maybe great, that's skipped down biology in high school. Okay, so let's look at the third objective, explain how the COVID-19 vaccine was created so quickly. Really, it usually takes a long time. So in this picture, a little bit melodramatically, I've shown you a cartoon of the R&D Valley of Death. That's actually what people call it. And that's really that space between an idea, like, wow, we can create a vaccine, and actually the application. We can deliver the vaccine. And usually that takes 10 years. And the reason why it takes 10 years, you can just think about when you make a vaccine, you'd have to come up with the thing and have it in stable form. You would then have to do animal studies on that. Then you'd have to call your lawyer and protect, the intellectual property because we live in America. Then you'd have to do phase 1 trials. Then you have to do phase 2 trials. It takes a long, long time. And when it comes down to it, it's a deficit or the natural requirement of technology and money in this space. If you were to put a dollar amount, I'm not sure I trust it 100%, but at least like 5, 10 years ago, the pharmaceutical companies would say it takes $3 billion to take a drug from start to finish. So if you look at the valley of death and see those deficits, then you say, okay, well, what happened with regards to technology or what happened with regards to money so as to bridge this valley of death and move quickly from idea to application? Well, the first thing that we did for technology was that China uh, released the genetic sequence for the Corona 19 virus on January 10th of 2020, so that there didn't need to be any search for the sequence of the protein, whether you produced it directly through by making the protein and then put it in a vaccine, or by producing the mRNA, which you inject into the body, so and have our cells produce those proteins. So that is depicted right here on the X, right? So we have the entire genome of the of SARS-CoV-2, but it's the spike protein that people started paying attention to, and they didn't have to start from square one. Um, so this is a little bit busy, but I just want you to show, and really this is for your own record, because I think this information could be useful for your other work, is that I want you to see it starts from up here and then moves across and goes to the bottom, that because of MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome that was related to SARS and SARS-1 in Hong Kong and SARS-2, what we're experiencing now, because of MERS, what was happening in the Middle East, two individuals, one named McClellan from the University of Texas and one named Graham from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, they found the COVID spike protein and they stabilized it. What I mean by that is that it's pretty easy to produce the protein, spike protein, but as soon as you put it into the body, it contorts. And through mutations that they initiated, they were able to stabilize that protein so that what you saw before injection was exactly what the body saw after injection. Then fast forward 5 years, they said, I really like this, and this could be um, uh, really important to the next pandemic, whenever that is. And so in 2017, they partnered with Moderna, right, one of the producers of the vaccine, who had a lot of experience in mRNA technology. And we're trying to make a mRNA vaccine for HIV and for Ebola. And they said, hey, how about we would do this for this coronavirus? Although they didn't know that we were about to experience a pandemic in 2020. And then in mid 2019, again, before the pandemic, they said, let's get really serious. And they essentially made the vaccine. Then, as it would have it, in late 2019, there were those pneumonia clusters. Then there was the Chinese scientists that released the genome in January. And then we're down here. As soon as Zhang Yong released the genome, they started, McClellan and Graham, they started the mRNA vaccine um, um, uh, through Moderna. And at the same time, just coincidentally, Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson said, okay, we want in this as well. So then we see the remnants of AstraZeneca. We see at Oxford University, who had again also done mRNA research. They wanted to get into the business and they decided to partner with AstraZeneca. They actually called Pfizer first, but Pfizer said, no, we're already working with BioNTech, so you have to work with AstraZeneca. And that's only relevant because AstraZeneca had never produced a vaccine before. And so many of you have probably seen how hard it has been for AstraZeneca to get its product out of clinical trials. And it's still not approved in the United States. And it's probably because Oxford worked with a pharmaceutical that hadn't done clinical trials, or I should say vaccine production. And then you see, and I'm going to talk this a little bit more about how now we have the technology that, bridge just happened, to be, the topic of conversation for years, this mRNA vaccine. But then we also see bridging through money. We see the U.S. in March of 2021 gives Johnson and Johnson, who you all have heard about recently because they just got their vaccine approved last week. It gave them $456 million just to do research and development on the vaccine. And the same for AstraZeneca. AstraZeneca, US gave it $1.2 billion. So in September 21, there's already phase 3 trials for all the vaccines. And then December 21, you probably saw the first FDA approved emergency authorization, which had never been done before, not only for mRNA vaccine, but any vaccine for Pfizer and Moderna. So to be a little bit more deliberate about how money does talk, I want you to see that Pfizer was given $1.9 billion for 100 million doses, and they're on contract for another 100 million doses, probably at equivalent cost. Pfizer always said they never, participated in the upfront funding through the Trump administration's vaccine program. That's true, but it's a little bit untrue to say that they didn't have an incentive because they already knew that they had a buyer if they were successful with the vaccine. Moderna, unlike Pfizer, got some $483 million of upfront money, but then $1.5 billion for 100 million doses. AstraZeneca, even though they're not approved, has already gotten $1.2 billion for 300 million doses. And Johnson Johnson also got R&D money and just got paid $1 billion for 100 million doses, which they promised by end of May. Okay, so let's look at safety and efficacy. First, I just want to say generally that the population has to be either immunized or have gotten a disease to 70% of its proportion in order to have herd immunity. And herd immunity just refers to a status of society in which you could walk around and not be worried about infection to any large or multiplicative degree. Another general statement about the vaccine is that it doesn't apply to anyone less than 12. Not that 12-year-olds don't have human bodies, rather that they have not done a clinical trial on 12-year-olds. I'm not sure this is going to happen. I mean, you saw the infection rates and the morbidity and mortality consequences of children, and it basically doesn't affect them relatively. So it may not make sense to do those vaccine trials and distribution. On the other hand, I think this is a serious enough virus and a paranoid enough virus to probably mean that children will get vaccinated at some time in the future, but not this year. The only thing I can say about the safety is because this is a relatively new vaccine, right? You don't really find things until later, is that the FDA required, because this was becoming so political, that all vaccine manufacturers had to first do 2 months of safety data following phase 3 trials. And so that was a very unique ask. And from that, nothing came up. This is not that scientific, but this is like a major, attention getter. And you can imagine that the vaccine companies are not able to, they're going to be, they have every incentive to be very, very transparent. And finally, I would say that this is not a dirty vaccine, right? Because we don't have to make proteins and inject it into the body, and instead we inject mRNA or a virus with a virus with DNA complement. It tends to be a cleaner vaccine. Okay, so what happened with the phase 3 trials for these vaccines? They're all really, really good. And just to put it in perspective, a flu vaccine is only 50% effective. And I don't know if you remember the diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis shots. You have to get 5 of them because it's only about 25% effective. So you have to get 5 of it to get to a reasonable level. So the Pfizer vaccine was 95% effective. after 2 shots. And all that means is that if you have 100 people, right, but they had 30,000 or 40,000, I should say, if you have 100 people, 95 will not, oh, sorry, if you have 100 people and let's say 20 people got it, right, um, only two would be have been vaccinated and the rest not vaccinated. But what's also amazing about the trial is that even if you got it, no one got sick to go to the hospital and no one died, right? And the same for Moderna. It was 95% effective against infection. But even if you got it, you never went to the hospital and you never died. And that's why, thankfully, we're seeing that those people that are vaccinated, there's new recommendations out of this CDC that families that have vaccinated individuals can now be together without a mask, so long as that they practice good safety practices in and out of the household. Finally, we see Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca. Um, I want to distinguish these because, again, these are the vaccines that use a virus to infect ourselves with a DNA COVID-19 complement, right, to get that mRNA. That's important because that means they can produce a ton of it. So AstraZeneca can produce 3 billion doses of this vaccine just this year once they clear clinical trials. Also, the way that DNA is much more stable, so it doesn't need to be stored on dry ice like the Pfizer, or Moderna only lasts for 30 days in the refrigerator. These compounds last for 6 months in a standard refrigerator, and they're effective. Now, are they as effective? No, but Johnson & Johnson is 66.1% effective after just a single shot, and AstraZeneca is 70.4% effective. And again, really 60, 70% would be good enough, although I think we've been anchored to 90%. Well, we've all been scared to death about these variants. Variants are normal, right? Viruses are going to have to adapt, otherwise they'll die. And when they adapt, either they will become less strong and virulent, right? And or, and let's hope it's, and or they won't be susceptible to our vaccine. And that makes sense, right? A variant is going to change its conformation. And so the mechanism that we use to recognize the spike protein will be less effective. But it could be it's less effective to a less virulent strain. Or here's two examples of strains that did not become more virulent, but they are still as virulent. And one is from the UK called the B117 variant, and another one is South African strain, B1351. It's much more evasive. So how did our vaccines do? They did pretty well still. Like Pfizer was 80% effective against the British variant. Moderna was less effective, but because of the technology, they've already introduced a new booster against the South African variant, and it's already in clinical trials. The Johnson Johnson just came out, and just know that it's only 66% to 6% effective against the strain that they were made for. So for the new strains, it's not going to be as effective. And finally, AstraZeneca was very, very effective against a UK strain, but not effective for the South African strain. And so it's not even used in South Africa because of that. So conclusions, we know how to control COVID-19, and it's much about the vaccine because of our cultural makeup, right? We're a very technologically oriented society, and we don't like the complication of like behavior change. And even though if you wore a mask, let's say everyone wore a mask for 3 weeks and socially distanced, this thing would be over. I was just doing some math, right? You can't say, oh, you can't just stay inside. Well, we've had two stimulus bills, both about $2 trillion. And it turns out if I took 320 million people into $2 trillion, that would be $12,000 $6,000 for every individual. And so I think sometimes it's more not about an all or nothing, but what happens if we had social distancing and we have masks, but in the context that people got, 6,000 per family member of support, I think people would sort of figure out a way to do it. Still, the vaccine is amazing and it can return life to conditions before COVID-19. I think we're seeing that already, but more in anticipation of it going well. For example, Texas, surprise, surprise, they just dropped their mandatory mask requirement, although less than 10% of the population has been vaccinated. So it's going to return back, but we're not there yet. And so while we roll this out, it's still important that people wear their masks and socially distance. And finally, the evidence suggests that COVID-19 is safe and effective. I got the vaccine myself and I really had no reservations. There was part of me that thought, well, I don't necessarily need to get it, but I was selfishly thinking that maybe then I could travel or maybe my mom wouldn't fear me. And it worked, it worked. Sometimes I think you have to give, despite complication, the system the benefit of the doubt. And at least my read right now is the COVID-19 vaccine is a really good preventative therapeutic, but we certainly paid for it. Billions and billions and billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical industry to help them bridge that R&D valley of death when they already had some help with the technology piece. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Wilson. I think we're going to jump into Q&A. Many of our, um, participants right now, they work directly with immigrant communities. And can you talk a little bit about, how to figure out the messaging on how safe the vaccine is to people that they support? Because there are a lot of doubts around this. I know you talked about it throughout your presentation, but just sort of more key driving points to how to convince or convey this message to those who may still have hesitations.
Sure. Well, my pat answer would be that I'm just going to be like the scientist doctor and just let the coalition figure that out, right? Because that's where your expertise is. But I was thinking about this just as some comments or observation. My understanding of why people, are still skeptical, especially from minority communities, is that it always seems like the system is never really that caring um, before, right? Even during the pandemic, right? How many immigrant populations had to continue working and put themselves at risk? I'm looking and thinking about ancillary staff. They have to clean the rooms, and we all just didn't have any masks, and we didn't have, the proper PPE. I'm thinking about someone who's like delivering food, and they don't want to do it, but they have to, right? People that are working the fields, how they were only considered essential workers when it fit the needs of society, but never them. Right before that, they're just rounded up and deported. So I think it's about understanding what happened before. I know that's really stupid, or maybe to simplify it, if certain populations won't even wear a mask, why would we expect those populations even to be express interest in vaccination? I think that's one piece. And the other piece is, maybe doing, addressing this concept of, or maybe just asking directly what it would take. I did a lot of reading about, it's not an all or nothing. Like looking at Black populations, and I know this would be a little bit different from the Immigration Coalition's constituencies, but they want a wait and see. They have a wait and see posture to it. They want to see it roll out a little bit longer before they act on it. And then I think the final piece of it is I myself don't know how to get, your parents the vaccination. I have no idea. So I think sometimes the things that we take for granted as like, oh, I'm just going to call this number and get XYZ vaccinated. Um, I think a lot of populations don't even know what are the networks and to get access to the vaccine. So yeah, I fumble with that a little bit, but I basically say like, okay, if you don't trust someone before, you're not going to trust them now, right? The second one is you could, ask people and try to address those issues, and you might find that people just have a rational, I just want to see how it's going to work, right? That's, not that I'm dumb, I just want to see. It's like it takes some while to get used to it. Let me think about how long it took for us to learn how to wear a mask. And finally, maybe the systems of access are not very clear, not multicultural.
Thank you. Just, I guess you touched on it before in one of your slides, but just want to ask this again. Going forward, how will we know how well the vaccines work on the newer strains of the virus? Should we expect they will continue to be about as effective or mostly effective on these newer strains? I know
Yeah.
you gave some statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a doomsday scenario. What's the doomsday scenario would be that we roll out the vaccine and it would be great, but then society just frees up and decides to demask and go to spring break, which is coming up, and the summer, and just be crazy, right? You could have so much spread of the variant, right, at a time that we could control it just because it doesn't have anyone to attack, to the point that the variant varies enough that, we don't have control anymore. It's interesting. I don't even know, for example, if we'll have to have vaccinations once a year, right? There's no data on how long we're going to have immunity to this, right? We have some things like hepatitis B that we're immune for forever, right? And then we have things like tetanus is like 10 years, but then we have things like flu is at 1 year. And I don't know if coronavirus is going to be the 1 year. So either way, either, you know, the data looks good right now on the variants, but we still better be serious about non-vaccine behaviors so that we don't have tremendous spread of, the variant while we're trying to get it under control, to allow for the appearance of other variants that, that will make this much longer than it already has been.
Another question is, how effective is the Pfizer vaccine towards the South African and Brazilian variants? How often will we have to take the vaccine? Every year?
Yeah. So the last one, that's one I don't know. Let's hope it's not every year, or hope that we get to something like Taiwan or China where it just doesn't even exist. It's not even around here, and that we have pockets of infection, and then we can quarantine out. Um, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine are definitely active um, against the variants, the worst variants in terms of the Brazilian and the South African. It decreased the response by tenfold, but that was still more than enough to neutralize, on at least bench science, all the um, uh, circulating viruses in someone that's infected. Do know, though, because these are mRNA vaccines, that the mRNA sequence can be um, manipulated to match the variant, right? So there's been recent discussion about how we in the United States should be more than just like, shoving Q-tips in our noses as the test, but we have to look for the variants as well. And we finally have more money in New York to do that, more money in California to do that. And as you swab for the variants, you sequence their spike protein, you see how similar or not similar it is to the one we have, and then we modify ours, and then we use that stabilization stuff that McClellan did, and we should be able to adapt. We should be able to adapt.
Yeah, the person who asked about the Pfizer vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine towards efficacy of Pfizer vaccine towards the South African and Brazilian variant, they got the Pfizer vaccine. So that was why that
Yeah.
intro.
Oh, great. Yeah, good. Yeah. Be glad you didn't get the Johnson Johnson. Not to say that's not a good vaccine. I sort of like, it's better than nothing. I shouldn't say that. It's a good vaccine. It's just not as good as, you're in the 65% range versus 95, you choose.
I think Selma from the audience raised their hand. Would you like to speak directly? You can, I think, unmute yourself. Is that right, Kiwi?
Salma, you
Yeah.
can speak now.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just struggling to figure out how to ask my question in words. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. I really appreciated your presentation. Um, thank you for keeping it accessible. And I just wanted to say, so the brief overview that you gave of how all these different pharmaceutical companies were working. I was wondering if, like, this whole time I've just been thinking, have I how are the pharmaceutical, I'm sorry, I'm struggling a little bit. What I'm asking is how, I wonder how this would have been different if we were not living under a capitalist system. I've been thinking about this a lot. Are, like, have these pharmaceutical companies, were they sharing their data and their information together, or were they trying to keep it like hidden because their their goal really is profit? I don't know if you have any opinions on that, or if you could share them, or even suggest some readings. I would appreciate it. And thank you again.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Really good. Well, first, I want to say some aspects of our, at least, academic research infrastructure, which still some would say is very capitalistic, really helped, right? Because when McClellan at the University of Texas worked with his compatriot at the National Institute of Infectious Disease, they shared the mRNA sequence that was stable to every single for-profit, right, that is now profiting, except Oxford and AstraZeneca, right? So that's pretty amazing, right? It's coming out of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and better believe University of Texas is receiving NIH funding, and the results of that research is getting shared with the for-profit pharmaceutical industry, and then they're doing these contracts, right? So you could say on the one hand, wait a second, we just gave you that stuff and now you're just like, breathing this dry. But you could also say, well, that maybe was the intention. The other piece I would say is depends. So for example, China, they didn't produce the vaccine. They failed, right? And Russia failed, but they're pretending that they didn't, right, with their Sputnik thing. Actually, they're not failing as much because they've now combined with AstraZeneca and Oxford. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, remember that slide on the Valley of Death, right? It's the putting up of money on the backside, saying that if you produce this drug or vaccine, I'm going to give you a windfall, right? Because if you don't do that in at least a capitalistic society, then people are going to say, well, why would I produce a vaccine? Like, for example, no one puts money in vaccines. You know why? First, they're wicked hard to produce. But second, you annihilate the pathology so you never can sell it again, right? As opposed to, I just like create a drug for diabetes. People are going to have diabetes forever. Great. I make a ton of cash. So the government had to address this valley of death piece, both in terms of technology, sharing information, and thank God, the Chinese researchers shared the genome for the SARS COVID-2 virus. And we live in a capitalist society, so we have to play by the rule. We have to use incentives that will work. And so putting up money to ensure the purchasing of a product means that then the pharmaceutical industry will put their efforts into producing a product that could benefit the entire population. I just think there has to be a really close relationship between what is the purpose of this money, right, and the ultimate use of that money. As a good, last piece I'll say it is this: you do want people that know what they're doing. Look at Oxford. They call Pfizer and like, hey, can we work with you? We know you produce vaccines all the time. So Pfizer says, no, I'm already working with, your other British counterpart. And they say, oh, that sucks. And then they pick up the phone and say, hey, AstraZeneca, you're British. Let's do a British thing. And then AstraZeneca says, yeah, let's do it. But they've never produced a vaccine before and it's been a disaster, right? Their clinical trials, right? So sometimes it is good to have people experience, but yeah, it's all cost and benefit, right? It's all cost and benefit. It's hard to say. I think I more say like it could always be better, and the more transparency and community involvement in these processes, the better.
Thank you so much.
I think just one comment is from the audience is thank you, because I provide workshops for my families, and I also invite providers like yourself to present workshops for my immigrant families on topics that immigrant families are concerned with. So I think that's an invitation for more speaking, but I wanted to be that note.